So I'm just gonna introduce myself. My name's Alina Sampian. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the Director of Racial Equity for the Seattle Center Cohort, which is a collective of arts and culture organizations that are engaged or wanting to engage in anti-racist work, hopefully to create more racially equitable organizations, a more racially equitable arts and culture sector. So that's a little bit about me. We always start our meetings and our programming with a land acknowledgement. And I just want to take this time to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish and Duwamish peoples, that we occupy this land. These land acknowledgements do not take the place of building authentic relationships with Indigenous and Native communities, but serves as a first step in acknowledging the land that we are on. And really resisting the erasure of Indigenous and Native people and Native stories and Native cultures. So I know that with the pandemic, it might feel challenging in finding ways to continue to build relationships and solidarity with those communities. But I highly encourage you to find ways to support to support those communities, especially now. If your organizations are giving land acknowledgements, if you're thinking about giving land acknowledgements, if you have a plaque or something on your wall, do you have relationships with those communities? That's really, really important to think about and to remember. So I wanted to lift that up. I also wanted to, for all of you that don't know, the Equal Justice Initiative, they have a museum and an organization that is headed by Brian Stevenson, and they released a calendar. And so every day they give you this day in history. So I wanted to just kind of share what the history was for today as a reminder to all of us that this work does not end. And even though today in 1901, what happened, what I'm going to share happened, we're not that far away. So September 3rd, 1901, Alabama adopted a new state constitution that prohibited interracial marriage and mandated separate schools for Black and white children. The state constitution's convention, their primary purpose was to legally disenfranchise Black voters, and the new constitution also included several electoral policies designed to suppress Black political power. Framers of this constitution knew that because of the 14th Amendment prohibited race-based disenfranchisement, discriminatory constitutional provisions intended to maintain white supremacy had to appear race neutral. To that end, the new constitution called for the appointment of 3 registrars from each county who had wide discretion when accepting registration applications and were chosen and trained to minimize registration by African Americans. The constitution's new registration rules also required voters to be able to read and write any section of the United States Constitution and have been legally, lawfully employed for the previous 12 months. I can't even do that. Skipping down a little further, Alabama was home to approximately 75,000 registered African-American voters before the new constitution was enacted, but drafters estimated that the new rules would reduce the number to less than 30,000. Alabama delegates approved the Constitution 132 to 12, and it still remains in place today. The state has amended the 1901 Constitution since its adoption, but has never held a convention to create a wholly new one. Several of the discriminatory provisions of the 1901 Constitution, including the mandate to maintain racially segregated public schools, have never been repealed. I found that very interesting that a new constitution has not been drafted since, even though there are amendments, that language is still in the Alabama state constitution. I'm really thinking about, 1901 was not that far to where we are today, and to still see what's happening in the world for Black folks, especially in the United States, to still be fighting for liberation, for basic freedoms, and the freedom to live. So I thought that was an important fact to share and encourage people to continue to explore that. So moving on to our panel, I just want to take a minute to introduce everybody. We have Ben Ruler, Executive Director of Seattle Works, Randy Engstrom, Executive Director of the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and Teresa Kern, who's the Director of Operations at Columbia Legal Services, who is graciously stepping in for Murph Eamon, who's the Executive Director, but Murph had to go in for emergency eye surgery, and is such a champ. I think Murph was actually trying to still do the panel and had some people say, like, you need to rest. So thank you so much, Teresa, for being here and for stepping in. So before we get started, I have some questions for each of you, but I wanted to explain the title behind the panel. So it's, what's the difference between leading with racial equity versus leading with anti-racism? The meaning behind that panel is, I think a lot of times we, the arts and culture sector has talked a lot about being racially equitable organizations, but not actually practicing anti-racism. And that is different. Racial equity is the condition that would exist if race was not a determining factor of almost everything. That is what we are working towards. But in order to work towards racial equity, we really have to be embodying and doing the work of anti-racism. And that looks very different. That is more active and it is less passive. It requires us to shift power. It requires us to be uncomfortable. It requires us to take the pyramid of power that we usually have and flip it. Which I think even saying that, some people are like, oh yeah, no, I don't want to do that. So what I thought would be great for this panel is to have specifically like white folks talk about like their journey in this work, how they have moved through discomfort, how they have helped their organizations, what are barriers they face, what are lessons that they've learned, why are they invested in doing anti-racist work. So that's kind of I know the title was probably a little confusing. People are like, aren't that the same thing? But I feel like one is more passive and one is more active. So that's where I wanted to start. If you have questions, I'm gonna encourage you to drop them in the Q&A. And I will pass those on to the panelists. But I have some questions first. So why should anti-racism work be prioritized? And I'm asking that because I think, especially now in all sectors, that because of COVID, people are really struggling with funding. They're struggling to keep employees employed. They're struggling to keep their lights on in their building. And I think that there's this battle between I have to pick anti-racism or I have to pick keeping my employees. And those should not be at war with each other. So why, for each of you, do you think that anti-racism work is a priority and should be? Anybody can take that, whoever wants to jump in first.
I'd be happy to. I think that anti-racism is and should be a priority in all of our work because our liberations are tied. It's a little bit hard, I think, and it is a journey for each individual white person in the world to understand the costs of oppression to us. I think that COVID has really laid bare and demonstrated the ways in which we ourselves are experience oppression that we're able to maybe not necessarily engage with as deeply in other environments. We could take any type of physical well-being, whether it be intellectual, moral, psychological, and draw a straight line between the oppression of people of color, particularly Black people in our country, and the way that oppression robs us and damages us as well. It's not always easy work to turn the lens on ourselves and center ourselves. We're as white people doing anti-racist and liberation work, we're not trying to focus on ourselves. However, until we realize and really examine how oppression for people of color in our world also harms us, I think that will sort of move us along on a spectrum.
Yeah, all of our liberation is tied. tied into one another. Like white supremacy culture, structural institutional racism hurts all of us.
Thanks for the question, Alina. Ditto to what Teresa said. And I think the status quo is just not cutting it. And unfortunately, for many of our workplaces, despite good people, good intention, good missions, there are systemic toxic norms. Many of them are rooted in that white supremacy culture, like that great article you sent, Alina, which we've looked a lot at Seattle Works, and to sort of look in the mirror and say, wow, we've got good people, good intention, good values, good programs, but this is a drastically different experience for staff, board members, participants who identify as BIPOC. That sucks to realize that because we're trying to do right. But I think one of the reasons we must focus on dismantling racism by taking action is to do right by our people, first and foremost, to create workplace cultures that are not so harmful and that truly allow all of us to sort of have the ability to thrive in our careers and our human potential. So I think there's a moral responsibility there too. Then also you look at Seattle Works, an organization I have the privilege of being part of. I think we have a mandate to dismantle racism in our institution because it directly correlates to our mission and our vision. And in order to honor that, we need to incorporate an anti-racist approach to everything we do. And so it's not a separate committee, it's not a separate effort, it's not a siloed thing that we'll do when we have time. It is an investment in our mission. Now it's hard because it means maybe going a little slower to change culture, policies, practices internally, but it is a long-term investment in our ability to advance our mission locally. So those are a few reasons why I think it's really important. I had the privilege of sitting on the Lunch and Learn, or the call last week that you hosted, Alina, with Nikita Oliver and Gabriel Teodros and Karen Taylor. And I think it was Nikita or Karen, they were talking about how anti-racism is a practice, right? It's constantly practicing and working. And I like that we talk about dismantling racism as an ongoing action with no end, but you flex those muscles and you keep doing it and doing it. And it becomes more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We had a facilitator last year, Kirsten Harris-Talley, she's now running for, I think, a state representative position, a really remarkable local leader. She said, DEI is the new colorblind. And I think there's something to that. Like, we can't just be talking about DEI, we have to talk about actions to dismantle racism. Those actions mean shifting policies, practices, and cultures, and that takes real concrete work.
Yeah, it takes concrete work. It takes being bold. I think Karen was the one that was like, when you're in that meeting or you're with your family or you're with your friends, you're in a call, like whatever, am I in the room with you? Like, are you speaking up? Like, when there are no Black folks in the room, like, what are you willing to risk to actually like practice and say that you're being anti-racist, not just block out your social media or make a Black Lives Matter statement, but like, are you carrying me? Like, do you care about me as a person, and are you bringing me into those situations? Randy, what about for you?
Yeah, thanks for that, Alina. Thanks for having me here. And what you just said made me think about a quote from Ijeoma Oluo, who's obviously a brilliant human, also partner of Gabe, who was on last week, where she said, I think it was in her book, You Want to Talk About Race, anti-racism means confronting racism and bias wherever you encounter it, including in yourself. And I think that particularly as a white leader in a white institution, that part about it being a practice, it being a muscle you have to work out every day, and about not ever holding an assumption that you've checked the box or completed it. I think that's actually the most insidious part of DEI as a construct, is that it's like a badging system. You've achieved, you've unlocked diversity, you've unlocked inclusion, you've unlocked equity. And I think that's it's a journey and a muscle, not a transaction. I totally agree with what both my fellow panelists said around it being a moral imperative, and and that our dignity and our destiny are tied. Our liberation is tied. And I think, COVID was not the the cause of our inequity. It was an accelerant on our inequity, and it has caused such a seismic dismantling of so many of the systems that govern our lives. And I think it just laid bare the instability and unsustainability of the systems that we work within. The nonprofit industrial complex was not thriving prior to COVID. Our structures were not less racist prior to COVID, and I think it's just been exposed. And now we have a choice about the way in which we're going to put back our communities, the ways in which we're going to build back and restore our communities. And I think it's an opportunity that we've been given to really reimagine what those could look like. And in just in the last 6 months, I've seen a handful of organizations, Wanawari and Langston as examples, that have tremendously amplified their presence and their strength and their role in the community because they are intimately tied to their values. The organizations that are going to make it through this are the ones that are intimately values driven and trusted by their community. And that isn't to say any of this is easy. I don't think anyone is enjoying COVID or the reckoning that our city and our country are having. But I think the ones that have invested in trust and relationship, that believe deeply in the power of self-determination and cultural expression as democratic rights, I think those are the organizations, institutions, collectives that are likely to weather the storm. And I think it's not only a moral imperative, it's not only that our destinies are tied together, I think it's actually the most critical strategic choice you can make to be successful for the next 10, 20, 50 years.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think with COVID and with the racial unrest that is happening in this country right now, I mean, this has been coming. There was already a powder keg that was created, and it showed up in a white officer in Minneapolis, and I think that lit a match for people where, like, we're not going to sit by anymore, and it's really important that as arts and culture organizations or as advocacy organizations, art is a form of social justice. Social justice is political. Political is personal. We cannot separate those things. There are, guidelines. If, for example, you're a radio station, you have to follow FCC guidelines, right? You can't say go vote for this person. But there are ways in which, even by not making a statement, that is a political statement. And how we're thinking about our organizations moving forward will be really telling over the next 10, 20, 30 years. People are paying attention to your organizations, and it will be very important and very obvious people who are really embodying anti-racism work and organizations who are not, and individuals who are not. That will be really relevant. Acknowledging that this work is hard and it's challenging. Culture change takes a long time. What have been the biggest barriers that your organizations have faced, and how have you worked to address them? It's kind of that's a big question.
Well, I got to go last time, so I'll go first this time. I think that's a really big question when you're talking about government. So much of the inequity that exists today is a direct result of public policy and decisions that were made to privilege folks that look like me over folks that don't. And so there's so much, I feel like there's a responsibility to mitigate the historical impact of the choices that the public sector has made and the ways in which it's extracted wealth from communities of color and stolen labor from so many. I think the challenge, one challenge goes back to that DEI thing where we're so good at saying it and we're so bad at doing it. The city's had a race and social justice initiative since 2004. It's survived like 6 mayors. And, I would argue that while we may even mean the words we say, often our budgets and our policies do not reflect the rhetoric in that language. And it's not like it's new. 16 years is a long time to be talking about white privilege and white supremacy culture and not have fundamental change. And I think that's because two things. Government is designed as a tool of risk mitigation. It is not supposed to move far, and it is supposed to not take chances. And so it is loath to make bold choices and to lean into its sort of civic imagination. And it is by design a command and control construct. It is not, I think that Nikita says this all the time, that I think the folks impacted by structural oppression are the best positioned to inform the solutions that will repair it. And so government is not very good at ceding the decision-making, the power and the resources to the hands of the people impacted by the systems their policies harm. That's just the design of the system. So we have to, we're having conversations about participatory budgeting, or about, we use a peer review process to do a lot of our grant making. There are things like the Equitable Development Initiative that are fantastic models of how government can do better. But I think the resistance is that the machine that I work in was inherently designed to prevent radical change and equity in distribution of power and resources. It is not an instrument of social justice. That wasn't what it was created for. So working within that machine to try to get it to do better is a little bit crazy making. But I also think it's the one thing that is designed to protect the commons. It's not profit driven. It's not market driven. It's not private sector driven. It's not at the whims of a rich person who died with a lot of money and decided they wanted to, whatever their affinity philanthropy pursuit was. So it has a responsibility, for better or for worse, to look out for all of us, and in particular for the least of us. Do we do that? It's a fair question, probably an important conversation to have, one we should have every time we go to the ballot box. But I think that's the biggest challenge, is just that this system was built to do something very different than what we're talking about today.
Yeah, it is. How do we create something that looks different? I think the word like dismantling starts to freak people out, but it's not dismantling and then it's just anarchy. It's like, how do we dismantle like structures that are harming people and just create something that that is new, that benefits people who are most impacted, and because it is benefiting those folks, and benefits everybody. Ben?
Yeah, one of the challenges at Seattle Works was 25 years of whiteness. When I started at the organization 6 years ago, we were founded by white people. 16 out of 18 board members were white. The whole staff was white. And I'd say the culture was sort of a typical white nonprofit. And I say that with no judgment, just like a matter of fact. And we really had to take a good hard look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how does this still manifest today, this whiteness in our history? Same with like that powerful, 1901, what happened on this day, 1901. Like we have to look at how that history still shows up today. And so to Randy's point, if something's a priority, I think that needs to show up in time and budget. So that's what we started to do at Seattle Works. Like, where are the opportunities to create time and money to put to this? And you'll keep hearing me talk about consultants, because we have paid women of color consultants to help lead this work for us, and it has been transformational. We got a $10,000 grant. We hired Caprice Hollins of Cultures Connecting. She taught our board about how to have courageous conversations around race, because we white people were so fragile, we couldn't even talk about race. We're so worried about saying the wrong thing. And she coached our staff to have an equity team. And she said, it's going to take 3 years to change the culture of an organization. So you have to celebrate the small wins along the way. And it was really hard. In the beginning, it was really hard for me. I had a staff member say to me to my face, "Man, Ben, we're all talk. At least we're talking about this, because that's more than a lot of organizations are doing. But at the end of the day, we're all talk." Oh, that sucked. That hurt so bad. I felt so sad, like a failure, but also angry, like, how hard I'm working. Like, it is so hard to change the culture of an organization. I am trying. But again, that made it about me. I was taking it personally. You look in that white dominant, white supremacy norms that you sent, Alina, some of the antidotes are don't freaking take everything so damn personally. And that's where like I had to do my own work, reading Ijeoma Oluo's book that Randy mentioned, So You Want to Talk About Race. That was huge for me to help lead with radical humility and kind of play the long game and not get all defensive as a fragile white leader and take it all personally. I really had to do my own work in addition to Seattle Works work. And we started chipping away and dismantling racism and changing culture is so huge, but actually the work has been quite easy. It's taken time, hiring processes, naming cultural norms and documenting them and writing them down, changing interview processes, shifting power, decision-making, norming on that. That took a lot of work, but it's not rocket science. We had consultants lead us. We paid for trainings with HR and equity. We paid for incredible leaders like Ijeoma to come to our equity team meetings and help coach us. And there is incredible resources and expertise right here in Seattle, right in our own backyard. And at some point, I'd say maybe 6 months to a year, it started being like pit in your stomach to like invigorating, like, oh my gosh, we're doing this. Trust will come with time and performance. And with enough time and enough small wins, our board and staff started to have this trust. And that's been huge for us. But again, it all goes back to the relationships, the taking the time, and we really had to look internally. And before I turn it to Teresa, I'll just say too, like for me, I was a white executive director and I was kind of a hot mess. I was a new job at a new city. My daughter was born on a cafeteria floor and I was freaked out. Like I was walking a very fine tightrope like many of us are, especially now with my own mental health. So it's hard for me to show up as the best version of myself as a leader. And I think I've been better able to do this work the more self-love and grounded I have. And I know that might sound cheesy or like, oh yeah, as a white guy, I need to love myself. But the reality is if we're going to lead this work, we have to give ourselves grace and embrace the discomfort, right? We do not have a right to comfort. That's one of those white norms in there, like this right to comfort. And I'm somebody who values harmony. I want my team to be happy. I want people to love me, but we can't do this work without being uncomfortable. So I've been really proud of the work we've done at our board and staff to change representation, to shift power, and to change our policies and practices, and ultimately our culture at Seattle Works. And it's taken a number of years, but I feel like we've made really meaningful changes. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about them. Teresa, I'm sorry to be so long-winded. I'll kick it to you.
I'll throw out some different barriers that I have noticed. I think we have been on our current anti-racism or race equity journey since 2015. I think there's a lot of frustration along the way that we either weren't moving quickly enough, which was a problem because a lot of folks were tying in their minds success or the value of the work itself with productivity. Which actually has been a real, there's been a real need for a mind shift to what is productive, what is valuable to our organization, because it's not always having a perfect thing to produce and put out into the world. Oftentimes this work takes time, and being community led takes way more time than just having like a person sit in a room and do a thing. That doesn't really get us anywhere. And I think a lot of that was led by traits, characteristics of the white supremacy culture. A lot of folks were so uncomfortable that they just wanted to check a box and say, we did the thing, we changed the system. So really recentering that energy, refocusing on being okay with imperfection, and maybe not trying to get out of our own discomfort by either like turning an eye towards the organizational leaders, like, why haven't you done this yet? I think some other barriers, I think as many organizational resources as we have dedicated to our race equity and anti-racism work, we still all already had full or more than full jobs when we took it on. And things didn't start to shift until we dedicated real money and time to hire an equity director. And sometimes things have been more slow going because we all have too many things to do. And I think that's really real, especially when people decide they're going to take take on anti-racism work, it's important not to think of it as extra work, but as part of the work that we're already doing. And so a couple of tips to address those, I would say, like, continuing to institutionalize and invest the work. Like, now it is an expectation that we have caucuses, we have multiple retreats each year to talk about anti-racism. We have many dedicated, we have staff practicing patience and trying to remind other folks, like, there is no perfection here. And actively opposing and challenging the request for everything that we do to be perfect and be on some sort of expected timeline. And then my personal favorite, which makes the lawyers that I work with really bothers them, is to leave things in draft form. Like, I'm so sorry, this is what we have right now, and to not institutionalize this document is perfect, I have received all of the input, and this is the final form. I think get a life to that. You're going to have to change something in 6 months, and just reflecting that we're all continuing to learn and grow what best practices or promising practices actually are, because we think we know, but we do not know anything.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I appreciate just how vulnerable each of you are in talking about the work. I feel like sometimes there's this culture to be like, well, we can't tell anybody that like we're upholding white supremacy, or that we're a racist organization, or that racism is in our art form. Like, we can't say that because then we'll get canceled, or get our windows busted, or like whatever. That is the complete opposite of what we should be doing, because I think people read through that, they see that. And for organizations that, if we look nationally at organizations that are like, we don't have a problem, and then it comes out that actually there's a problem, it ends up being worse, rather than being vulnerable and saying, you know what, because we exist in a white supremacist culture within the context of race within the United States, we do uphold white supremacy culture, we do uphold racism exists, and it happens in our organizations, and this is, we're acknowledging that, and we're talking about tangibly moving forward. This is how we're working to address that, and then this is who we're accountable to. Which brings me to my next question. I think we throw around the word accountability a lot, and then I think partly piecing these two questions together, I've had there's been this question around, like, or frustration, I should say, that I've heard from some folks that are like, well, if racism is up to white people to fix, that's what I was trying to do, but then folks of color got mad and said that I was taking over, like, I don't understand. What's the difference between centering BIPOC voices and tokenizing them? Or, kind of like in that article that I sent that Murph did, when we were talking about, like, Murph talked about, we got into this place where we were deciding, oh gosh, this is terrible. We've got this information, racism exists, and now we're going to do all of these things. But then nothing changed about the culture. And it's because there was kind of the cart before the horse, or however, I just turned into a dad, however that saying goes. But really not looking at examining, like, racism or dynamics or cultural norms within our own organization, and just deciding that. So when we talk about accountability, we talk about centering the experiences of BIPOC folks in leading this work. One, what does accountability mean to you? Like, who are you accountable to? What does that look like for your organizations? And then if you can, talk about that difference. Like, when you hear people that are frustrated, they're like, I'm trying to do all this work and people are mad at me. I thought it was my responsibility to fix it, but BIPOC folks are upset. If you can talk to both of those things, maybe we'll take the accountability question first. But I have heard that frustration from white people, and they're like, we're trying to do something and people are upset. Just addressing that, like, that power dynamic. So accountability, what does that look like for each of your organizations? Who are you accountable to?
So I have an additional fun patriarchal spin that I often put on this, because women are often put in or put themselves in martyr type positions. I would say as leaders and as white people, we are accountable to our staff and we're accountable to our client communities. And what that looks like is first recognizing that like we are not here to save people of color. That is not our job. We are not martyrs. We are here to whatever terms we prefer to use, co-conspirator, to dismantle systems of oppression. I think accountability, the difference between accountability and is always conflated, being accountable for an action or something that we did with our identity. I did this thing, I need to be accountable for it, so that means I'm a bad person, I'm racist, and y'all know it now. So I think we ourselves need to do the work to separate accountability from our own white guilt and shame, which is going to be like a lifetime of challenging and unlearning. But acknowledging when you make mistakes, owning it, like genuinely owning and apologizing to the person that you harmed. And then you got to pick yourself up and move on. Like staying in your self-centered circle of white guilt and shame actually isn't doing anyone any favors, including yourself. And then with white folks with each other, like instead of like canceling the person that did the one racist thing or that did something that turned out to be problematic, like actually being in community with them to work on that together in a white space, it brings more value than like canceling them or like, yeah, I can't believe she said that. It does way more for our community, I think, than just like distancing yourself from the mistake. And also like you're bound to make one as well. You just don't know it yet, whether it was public or private, whether it was in a small group or a large group. Just owning that we are imperfect and really institutionalizing the accountability of like apologizing for things that you did and moving on, and not curling up in a ball because you're white, I think are kind of like, it's been a really, really hard to do. And I think folks at the top of those positional authority pyramids often struggle the most because we're supposed to be, by the capitalistic nature of our structures, we're supposed to be perfect in 1,000 different ways anyway. So those are my
That's a great answer. I mean, I think that there is a lot of pressure for leadership to like not acknowledge when they make a mistake or they don't know everything or harm has happened, or like if I put myself on blast, then everyone's gonna like cancel me. Like I think one of those things, like for white folks and BIPOC folks, we also have to like do this work in a different way within our own communities when we're perpetuating harm amongst each other. But like for white folks, instead of like, oh crap, did you see what Karen did? Like, ooh, I'm glad I'm not Karen, or I'm not Becky, or like whatever name we are now associating that behavior with, not that person, but instead being like, yo, like as an accomplice or as an advocate, my job, part of anti-racism work as a white person, is to go and be like, hey, let's talk about why that was harmful, or like that was really uncomfortable, or maybe that was something that was public that happened. Like that person already is probably feeling bad enough. How can white folks like build power and do the work with white folks? So instead of getting canceled and then getting stuck into a cycle of like shame and guilt, which will just continue to uphold defensiveness, how can we do that work together? What about for other folks? Randy?
I just wanted to sort of co-sign what Teresa said about gender as like this work is also intersectional. And so I think the way that gender and sexual orientation, immigration status, physical and mental ability, like one of the ways people are able to decenter race is by saying, but what about, these other, and I think it's intersectional, and we know that race is the biggest predictor. And so I think it's important to both acknowledge and stand firm in the need to talk about race. I also, this thing, I think the being afraid to be called out, not wanting to do the wrong thing, not wanting to tokenize people is like uniquely powerful in Seattle culture, where we are so afraid to be wrong. As someone who like composts and drives a Prius, like I'm here to say I'm also complicit in that. But I think we got to be comfortable in discomfort. This work is uncomfortable. It is centuries long systems of harm that are being laid bare, and we're going to make mistakes. It is inevitable. And I think you know, I think that I have lots of feelings about the idea of cancel culture, because I sort of feel like getting called out might have just mean you screwed up and like you needed to be called out, and people are allowed to call it out. And then I think redemption is also possible. I think growth is also possible. I think we learn, we fail forward. I think that's a really important part of racial justice work. I also think that this idea of, it's come up a couple times in this conversation, like equity versus the work or equity versus staff. I think that's a false choice. I think if you still see those things as a binary choice, you're not there yet. And that the work of justice and the work of addressing racial inequity, it's all of our work, and it should be part of all of our work. And it shouldn't be a training we do once. It should be a thing that we do as a practice, a commitment that we have to a practice. When I think about accountability, the thing that comes to mind the most is about a month ago, we have about 40 staff at the Office of Arts and Culture. The 11 Black staff came to the rest of the office with a letter that was incredibly powerful, and also a list of demands of the things they needed to see changed. And they invited us into a conversation. They invited leadership into a conversation, and they invited all staff into a conversation. And I think it provided the clearest North Star that I've seen. And it illuminated so many of the ways that, even well-intentioned, our rhetoric didn't match our results. It didn't match our impact. And so I'm accountable to them. I also think, you know, their words are theirs, so I'm not going to share too much detail about what it said, but needless to say, it's going to shift our practice. It's going to shift where our resources go. You know, I think we've worked hard to partner with our Arts Commission, which is majority BIPOC, and does sort of worked in partnership with us around racial justice. We have a group of BIPOC advisors that govern our King Street Station programming whenever we're allowed to do programming again. And we have a couple of other cohorts, the Building Art Space Equitably cohort, and a few others that center people of color specifically, and let them drive the work. And I think it's sort of like letting it's that self-determination piece. So I think, I mean, there's no end to who we're accountable to, but I think it has to be both internal to the organization and external to the community. And I think you just have to be okay with being uncomfortable. Like, you can't avoid the conversation, and you're gonna make mistakes. So accept that as a baseline, and then figure out how to move forward. You know, and I think the more you show up vulnerably, the more you're willing to learn and grow. I think the more trust you earn, and the more those other folks will stand with you as we are together figuring this out.
Yeah, being uncomfortable is part of the work. Ben, what about you?
Yeah, I always reserve the right to wake up tomorrow a little bit better than I am today. To Randy's point about like internal and external, Alina, when you asked the question, who are you most accountable to? My mind went a lot of different ways, and I feel like I could answer that a bunch of different ways. But what I came to is what I think been most important is being accountable to staff members in the organization, and BIPOC staff members in particular. It's taken years for us to sort of get our house in order in that sense, and really, I think, do right internally. And by focusing on that and being accountable to our staff, then that allows us to be more accountable to our mission and externally. But that's where I think accountability really needs to start, and where I think a lot of organizations miss. They want to talk about diversity and programming and you know, external stuff without going through the fire and taking a good hard look in the mirror internally. So that would be my answer to your question. And I think also when we think about, you know, relationships and being accountable to the community, I think it was Teresa, my fellow panelist here, who was saying that you know, relationships, are you around, and are you you know, in it for the long haul? So at Seattle Works, we've been trying to do some things like, you know, everybody on staff every month attends a monthly coalition meeting that is sort of led by and supporting communities of color and organizations serving communities of color. So for years, you know, we've been attending the Southeast Seattle Education Coalition meeting. for example, the monthly meetup that one of my wonderful colleagues started representing Seattle Works there, and we've been able to continue even after that person has moved on, and sort of showing up indefinitely over years and building relationships, I think really matters in terms of understanding, you know, what our role is to step in and what our role is to stay out of the way, and just being educated and accountable. And again, I think the accountability comes from deep listening and deep relationships, and that takes time. But we must start internally and do right by our staff and our BIPOC staff, because if we miss or skip that, then everything else, I believe, is for naught.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that brings up too, like, if you don't have BIPOC staff, like, that's something you need to address. Why? Like, questioning, like, why is that? Are there cultural norms, like, especially in the document that I sent the email earlier around white supremacy cultural norms of like, oh, that person's not a good culture fit. Maybe your culture is not a good fit for them. And really trying to like think about like, what is it our culture that has prevented BIPOC folks from not just being in our organization, but being in leadership positions, and not being in leadership positions because you've rearranged in a way for people to continue to maintain their power, but power has actually shifted and something had to go. Something had to be
Alina,
arranged. Like, yeah.
Oh, please excuse me. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No. Do it. My question was going to be about power, and I wanted you to actually.
Yeah. Well, one with our board, we have about 18 board members, and over half are BIPOC, and that really came from saying a few years ago, like, you know, despite good intentions and values, you know, our whole sector, racial demographics haven't changed on nonprofit boards in 25 years, right? Boards have gone from 86% white to 84% white since I was in high school 25 years ago. Yet if you ask every board chair, they'll say, we want a more diverse board, we value diversity. And so like those intentions and values are not translating to shifting power on nonprofit boards. So we had to look at Seattle Works and say, yeah, we've been talking about this for a while and trying in some ways, but we're not moving the needle. So we are not going to vote on a new slate of board members unless 1/3 identify as BIPOC, period. If that's not the case, we're not bringing on new board members. We're not voting on this new slate. So there was some accountability there. On staff, we started honoring, or looking for lived experience, valuing that as much as formal education, and really, saying if we're going to advance anti-racist work, we want people with these values and experiences and expertise who can help drive that. So we screened for that in the hiring process and have hired outstanding candidates, candidates of color who are just transforming our organization. But really what I want to share is that we're now talking about, we are actually in the process right now, as we speak, of moving to a flat organization. Super scary, super exciting, totally shifting power, equal titles, equal pay, some really radical sort of, worker-directed, shared responsibility, worker self-directed organizations. It's really exciting and really scary. We're figuring out what are the implications for board governance, hiring the supervising executive director. Like, this is really wild, and it's really uncomfortable for me. I'm probably taking a voluntary pay cut and totally shifting power, and it's really invigorating. But I think, again, like we as white leaders can't say we're going to dismantle racism, but only to the point where it feels really uncomfortable, right? Like, we've hired outstanding candidates of color to lead our content and our advocacy, and we're starting to talk about things like defund the police on our social media. When I first saw that we were posting that, I was kind of like, oh my gosh, okay, let me take a deep breath here. Do I stand by this? Are we really saying this? And then it's like, actually, you know what, if we're saying we're centering and accountable to BIPOC communities and those most, affected by over-policing and racism, then we need to believe and trust that. And it's not about whether I feel comfortable. It's about Seattle Works has said, this is a value and this is who we're accountable to. So we're riding. And at the end of the day, I think Randy was saying, like, in the long haul, we want to be on the right side of history, and it's going to be messy and uncomfortable. It's going to be radically imperfect, but we are really trying to shift power through representation on staff and board and actual power, decision-making over hiring, over programmatic decisions, over budgetary decisions. My friend Vu Le, who was the founder of RVC, one of the pioneer organizations focusing on equity in our sector locally, shared with me about a year before he left, you know, that this was in motion, that he was going to be moving on from that role. I said, how are you feeling about the sustainability of the organization? And he was like, you know, Ben, I really don't make that many decisions anymore. You know, because real leaders, we make ourselves obsolete a little bit. Not that I'm obsolete, but like he shifted power enough to be like, it's shared, it's distributed. That's radical and that's powerful, and that takes time. But I think that's where we need to really look at how are we getting really uncomfortable? Because I'm really uncomfortable, but it's also really exciting.
Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that piece. Power is a big part of this. Like, power is a big part of privilege. Addressing power, like who has it? Why do we freak out like in wanting or needing to hold it? My dog's trying to open the back door, and he can't open the door. So I'm gonna ask this question really quickly. But what, you know, and I'm glad that you brought up VU, because that's actually one of my questions. Is like, VU wrote an article. I'm gonna drop it in the chat right now, talking about solutions privilege. And essentially in this article, he was talking about, I'm just gonna read this part of it, but there's the part where he's like, the inability to register solutions that we do not agree with. So the expectation for solutions, however, is paired with the inability to understand or even mentally register solutions that are proposed if they do not conform with our values. And one of the really funny like Twitter thing, I mean, I love his articles. He still does them even though he's not at Rainier Valley Corps anymore. But one of them was, he reposted a tweet from someone and talking about the gender pay gap. And I've shared this with some people, so sorry if this is repetitive, but the, I don't know if I can screenshot. Anyway, it's in the article that I posted in the chat, but essentially, you know, he kind of talks about like, this person is like, well, what will fix the gender pay gap? And the woman's like, pay employees the same as men. And the dude is like, well, what about in the short term? And she's like, pay all of your women employees the same now. And he says, but how? And she's like, literally change their pay. And then his response is, maybe we can teach women to negotiate better. And then the emoji response is just like a dagger of like, oh my God, you're not listening. You're only listening to things that make you comfortable. So when we're thinking about solutions privilege, like what has been the process for each of you? And this kind of goes back to the question around accountability. That was like a side note I added in to, well, what is, if white people are supposed to fix the work, why do BIPOC folks get mad when we jump in and decide to do it? And it's like, because we're not centering and allowing those folks to lead. Like, the decisions that we make to dismantle racism or white supremacy culture need to be informed by the voices and lived experiences of BIPOC folks. That is how we transform systems. And your job, even my job as a light-skinned, like Mexican person, and how I am building solidarity with Black folks, is to decenter myself in the conversations, especially right now, around defunding, around policing, and to center Black folks in their lived experiences, because their lived experiences are not the same as mine. I can't be informed and make decisions that speak for community when I don't have those experiences. My role as someone in solidarity with like Black and Indigenous folks, and like the disproportionate impact, especially for Black folks right now in policing, the way I stand in solidarity is to listen, is to have relationships with those folks, to listen, to say thank you, and this is how I'm going to move forward. So, in speaking to solutions privilege, what has that looked like for each of your organizations? How was that process? Because Ben, I mean, you kind of touched on it. Somebody was like, we're going to post this, or maybe they just post it and you're like, whoa, wait a second, that is making me uncomfortable. Now I have to grapple with that. Or Teresa, even for you, and working with clients, and like the legal system is very structured. But all of you, regardless of whether in legal work or arts work, are all facing the same things. Can you speak to that idea of solutions privilege?
Yeah, I mean, so this is my 16th year working within the legal aid community. I spent 10 years at the ACLU before I came over to Columbia Legal, and I would say one of the biggest challenges and where CLS has moved the most is being community-led, but that doesn't mean that we don't still constantly step in it when it comes to whether or not we're taking authentic direction from our community and whether or not we're building authentic relationships. So it's also, I have noticed there's a certain ivory tower mentality to the law where lawyers are classically trained to bring solutions. So they'll come in, meet with the community members, or they'll learn about an issue and they'll come in and say, well, like, this is how you fix this. I am going to tell you how to fix it. We're going to file this lawsuit, or we're going to push this legislation. And oftentimes we've learned a little bit later, like, like, oh, that's not what we wanted at all. so oftentimes, like, moving the law can be self-serving for legal aid organizations. So some of the tools we've used in the last few years to try to pay attention to that. I will say we also recently just got called in, I guess, for some of our COVID advocacy. You know, we filed an emergency lawsuit to try to move as many people out of prisons or jails a few months ago. Went immediately to the Washington Supreme Court, and then later, when debriefing that case, some folks from the community were like, "Hey, we didn't ask you to do that at all. Like, who asked you to file that lawsuit?" And it was a moment for our lawyers of like, "Oh, nobody did." I think some of the things we've moved towards are we require race equity analyses in anything we do, and any lawyer that wants to bring advocacy forward has to demonstrate how they took direction from the communities we partner with. And we have, like, internally and externally added restorative justice and conflict resolution processes to all of the work that we do. So oftentimes it's like, oh, I have, you know, this is the solution that I have decided upon. Like, you better be able to demonstrate like how that was informed by the communities that it is our either internally, like it better be informed by our staff, or externally it better be informed by the communities that we partner with, and it better be an authentic partnership.
Yeah, Randy or Ben?
I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of the defund SPD conversations and the larger protest movement generally. And like, there's the protesters and there's the folks who are the most impacted by structural racism, who I think should be and often are at the center of the protest conversation. But there's an awful lot of pundits and hot takes about like what the right way to protest is, or how they should be protest. Like Nikita posted something that I saw yesterday that was some very well-meaning lady recommending that she pause her protest until after the election because it's harming the possibility to get Trump out of office. And for all I know, that might be true, but that's not actually up to me. And I think when we're talking about what community safety really is or needs to be, I am very much at a growing edge. The idea of defunding the police department seemed like an impossible idea to me like 2 months ago, and then like got voted on by the city council like a month after that. So like it moves fast. And I think about it in the context of, you know, taking a knee was the wrong way to protest. Doing a walkout was the wrong way to protest. Marching in the streets is the wrong way to protest. There is no right way to protest. The right way to protest is to maintain the status quo and not change anything, or politely wait until your turn when called upon. And clearly that has never worked. So like, I'm trying to see where my blind spots are and see where it's appropriate for me to show up as an advocate or as an ally, an accomplice in that space in particular, in the protest movement and in the defund conversation. And I think it was brought up earlier. I think Ben was talking about nonprofit boards and how white they are. There's another study that I think folks in the room might be familiar with called More Than Money by Holly Sidford and Alexis Franz, that talks about how 8 years ago they did a study that said 60% of the philanthropic resources, public and private, in the arts sector go to 2% of the organizations that represent the white Western canon. And that in the 8 years since they did that research, they did another round of research. And what they found was we talk a lot more about equity and diversity now, and the numbers are actually worse. More of the money goes to the 2% of the organizations. But equity, like we all talk about, and I'm glad you brought up Vu, who's like one of my personal heroes. A bunch of years ago, he put out the article that said equity is the new coconut water. That was like 2014, I think. And like, that's the problem, right? We learn the language, but we don't change the practice. And I think that's, nobody was using the term BIPOC 4 months ago outside of like organizing spaces that I know of. And so the fact that like everyone's picked up the new language, everyone's picked up the new right way to talk about it. And I think there's still a misalignment around how practice follows the rhetoric.
There's just two things that I wanted to mention. One, I think by like 2050, the statistics are that majority of prime age working adults are going to be folks of color. I think 70% of that are going to be women of color. So if we're not already prioritizing this work, our organizations are not going to remain relevant for very long. Like that, the reality is that if we are not tangibly doing this work, we're not going to be around anyway. So I know that might seem harsh, but I think that's just the harsh reality of this work and of prioritizing it, especially as the demographics of the country change. They are changing. I posted the James Baldwin 1968 article that Esquire did after Dr. King's death. I put it in there specifically because James Baldwin talks about looting, just in regard to the protests that you've mentioned, and just the irony about that. Dr. Angela Davis also talks about that as well, just like you're talking about looting from a people that have been robbed of everything, and consistently are set up structurally, systematically to not receive the same benefits that white folks move about the world with. So that's why I dropped that in there. Ben, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that as well. And then we did have one question, but I'm encouraging folks to please keep asking questions.
You can move on to the questions. I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to step back and we can keep it flowing. Thank you, Ben. Okay.
One of the questions, and Teresa, you spoke to this too, around like what are, let me make sure I have, can you speak more about restorative processes and give examples of what that looks like? What does restorative justice look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So in case y'all did not figure it out, I work primarily center my focus in human resources practices and policies. So we have several. It has been a trip to move to the Pacific Northwest from the Midwest because I didn't realize the depth of the passive aggressive or just passive norms until I moved here. So it's been an interesting journey. I realized quickly on that like we needed some real structure to addressing conflict. So the first iteration of that, we do have a grievance process because we have a bargaining unit, but like the grievance process is awful. It's super adversarial and it doesn't actually restore relationships. And if we're going to be in relationship with with each other as an organization, we need to build and repair those relationships consistently. So we started, there's a book, Difficult Conversations. It has worksheets and ladders and things. Like Difficult Conversations is one tool. And then later, as our work evolved, our equity director introduced restorative justice to our organization. So restorative justice practices within the workplace operate instead of focusing on like resolution everyone's comfortable, and instead centers the attention on the person that was harmed and what they need. So the conversation is to not necessarily set us up for a back and forth. I did this because let me be defensive, let me explain why I did this thing, but instead like, I acknowledge that I harmed you, I'm gonna own that. What can I do to repair this relationship and move on? They can be tricky, sometimes they take time, and both parties have to want to participate in restorative justice in order to use it as a tool. One person cannot inflict restorative justice practices upon the other. Like, both parties need to go to it willingly.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, both folks have to be willing to engage in that that kind of conversation. And there are organizations in Seattle that practice that in very radical ways, like with sexual violence, with physical violence, and restorative, transformative justice also too has been something that thankfully I have amazing patient BIPOC friends of mine that have been practicing restorative and transformative justice that have been willing and vulnerable to share with me when I'm like, I am really struggling with this aspect of what that work looks like based on this harm, and my own need for retribution for something that doesn't even involve me, which is, talk about decentering, like that's stuff that I have to work on as well. But so sorry, but Ben, can you speak to that too, around, like, I know Seattle Works has a racial grievance policy, and speak to that restorative transformative justice work?
Yeah, I won't speak to how well Seattle Works is doing restorative justice or work in our staff, because I don't want to speak for our BIPOC staff, and I'm not sure how well we're doing it. But I will say some of the policies that we put in place to set us up for more accountability there. One is, as Alina just mentioned, we did create a racial grievance policy. It's separate from all the stuff in the employee handbook around like regular grievance and harassment policies. It's a racial grievance policy for staff members, board members, participants in our program, nonprofit partners. It's on our website, and there's a whole process there. We kind of had to invent it up. Unfortunately, there is not very many examples of this, at least not in our circles. So we're happy to share that. And we think that sends a powerful message, even just having that, especially to smaller organization with like not even like a real robust like HR department. And I think Teresa was talking about this too, like policies. We had millennial staff members years ago who were like, what's our standard operating policy? What's our standard operating policy? And I'm like, how many damn policies do we need? But I've now come around to understand that if it's not written down in writing and normed on an official, then it becomes a guessing game, right? And who does that benefit? Well, people like me. And so we have, have a manager toolkit that mandates managers approach our work with a racial grievance policy. We have more professional development funds for BIPOC colleagues, and we use those broadly. For example, we paid for my African-American colleague to go to a Black woman healing session for a weekend. And we know that that was important, like maybe it's not as linear tied to professional development, but it was acknowledging that we are limited in our ability to support our BIPOC colleagues at an organization our size, that we are a racist institution despite good intentions, and we're trying to get better, but that it is important that we bring in resources from the outside, and that it's an incredible burden to be a woman of color moving through this world, let alone trying to help an organization evolve. So it made sense to use our professional development funds that way. And maybe that's a little non-traditional, but hopefully that sent a great message to our colleagues that like, we really value you and we want to invest in you. We've also do these programs like BIPOC link ups, have self-care sessions where we've said it's important for our BIPOC colleagues to feel like they can have space away from their white colleagues to do their own restorative and healing work that's not burdened by white people. And we have white caucus meetups for the public and internally where we can process our own stuff without burdening our BIPOC colleagues. So again, it's lots of little things and it just takes time. It's, but we are putting the pieces in place, and over time that trust becomes built. But a lot of it has had to come from policies. And we named as an organization that we will interrupt white silence. We will interrupt white silence. Those are probably the 3 most important words on this whole journey. That's really held me accountable. I've always had great intentions and I think been a pretty decent white guy, but boy, have I been complicit, just by being quiet from grad school to high school to college, to workplaces, just not putting my own comfort ahead of speaking up, interrupting microaggressions, speaking truth to power, And now we have created an opt-out culture at Seattle Works. Not opt-in, we're like, hey, if you're down with dismantling racism and racial equity, come on, join this committee. No, it's opt-out. If you're not down with this, see yourself out of the organization. No, nothing personal, but that's when we're recruiting for board members, staff members, you know, funders, the whole thing. Like, this is how we're rolling, period. But again, it took years to kind of get to this kind of more opt-out culture, but just lots of time and lots of relationships. But like Teresa said, we have to, restorative work means leading with love and relationships, and that is hard. And I was so blown away with how Nikita Oliver spoke about that at your meeting last week, Alina, that you hosted, the healing circles that the youth are doing, and the power of actually leading with humanity and love and changing these like perfectionist white norms in our workplaces. It's really possible, and it's a beautiful vision.
Yeah, we don't talk about leading with love or relationship in our workplaces a lot, even though we spend so much time at work with people. And really, I mean, the need is there. Like, how many of our colleagues have to leave parts of themselves at the door, or at behind their screen, or even in their own home, now the world via Zoom, to show up to a meeting because they can't be fully who they are, because they have to be extra or perform in this way to fit into your norms, to your organization's norms, in order to, like, within capitalism, keep their job so they can take care of themselves. Like, really being willing to address that. And I like that opt-in, opt-out. We're not opt-out culture. If you're not on board, then don't be on our board, or don't. Then this isn't the organization for you, because we're committed to doing this work, and this is the way that it looks like. Randy, do you have anything to add to that, like with that process?
I mean, I think I think they said it pretty well. I just think it has to be about systemic, fundamental change, transformational change. The time for incrementalism, the time for like transactional, we're going to do a training, we're going to have a funding program like that. It has to be a fundamental commitment to a different structure. And that isn't to say we know all the ways we're going to get there, but to me, you know, you can't work at the edges, and you have to have I love that idea of opting out. I feel like, I don't know if we can legally say that as the city, but like, I feel like that's the culture we've tried to foster, that like, this is where we're going. And you know, even as we've done a lot of work I'm very proud of over the last 8 years, we clearly have a lot more work to do, and we have clearly not done enough. So you know, the journey continues, and I think that's what the restorative part looks like, is to keep going deeper and keep figuring out what that fundamental change can be, and really shifting from transactional to relational culture. Like, you can't do restorative work unless, as Teresa said, both parties are willing to go there. And that comes down to trust and relationship. If you don't have trust and relationship, then you're just talking at each other.
Yeah, trust is a big part of this work, and then I really appreciate you just bringing up on like how you were investing funds, even professional development funds, not even like money that has been set aside for racial equity or anti-racism, in really centering like BIPOC folks, and also shifting the culture to acknowledge that BIPOC folks need different things in doing this work than white folks do. I think unfortunately, sometimes a lot of our organizations have set aside racial equity money to do the work, but what ends up happening is like all that money is filtered to what white folks need, or it is filtered to coaching executives, or it is filtered to trainings for how not to do microaggressions, or like whatever. And unfortunately, like, even though that can be influenced by what BIPOC folks are saying, like, hey, these are experiences, this is what you need to do, BIPOC folks get left out. And then because culture change takes time, harm is happening in that process. And how are we ensuring that when we're doing anti-racism work, that we are also like listening and centering BIPOC folks, like, what do you need? Cool. You need to go to a retreat? Cool. You need to go to a healing circle? Cool. You need to like have a paid 2 days off or whatever to like really heal, and then that not have to come out of your sick or vacation time. We're just paying you to do the work of like taking care of yourself, and by doing the work means don't work and take care of yourself, is really valuable and really important. And I hope that organizations can start to, I don't think what you're saying, Ben, is radical. I think that is necessary. Teresa, are there ways that CLS has done that work to support BIPOC folks in the process of the work that you've been doing there?
So it's a bit of a journey. We started caucusing in 2015, and we did realize we need sort of separate line item budgets for our caucuses, because they have different design and they have different needs. So we do have an additional like in-person retreat for the people of color at our organization each year, and we sort of dedicate and let the group choose what it is that they need and what they would like to do with the funds. It's not predicated on the White Caucus doing something. They're completely separate groups. And currently we're kind of working through like during COVID, we're kind of working through like bringing in some compassion fatigue training. We just had some grief counselors come speak with our staff, and we're looking at whether or not those folks we would need like separate trainings for the people of color in our organization, or whether or not that would be like a staff-wide initiative. But I see on the horizon, just from my position, that we're in for a long winter, and I think just dedicating some additional resources that are not necessarily like equal across the board, but like differential based on, you know, equitably distributed is going to be pretty key headed into fall and winter, I think, for our staff.
Yeah, we talk about self-care all the time. We're like, I know, especially in work, in the work that you do, Teresa, direct service for people and dealing with cases that are like very difficult and sad and challenging, and where compassion fatigue comes into play. And then we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and you know, us being able to connect to people in the same way doesn't look like, this is not the same as like being able to hug your friend, or being able to, like, you know, be in a setting with someone, and yeah, and I think that even makes the idea around restorative practice when harm has been perpetuated even more important. Even though Zoom is not like super great in terms of being able to have conversations directly with someone, I think it's very important that we have those things set in place, because in anti-racism work for all of us as individuals and as organizations, we're going to perpetuate harm. In my position as a leader for the racial equity cohort at Seattle Center, it is not my intention to perpetuate harm. Harm is going to happen, and it is something that I have to acknowledge, that we all have to acknowledge in this work, and commit to addressing that. Kind of just in closing, and again, if anybody has any last minute questions, we have till 1:30, so drop them in the chat. But I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to, like, if you could say one thing that you have learned on your journeys, or one piece of advice or encouragement, based on the work that you have been doing, and based on it being challenging and getting uncomfortable, what would be something that you would leave with participants and organizations here in regards to doing anti-racism work?
I would leave with the notion of radical humility, to know that we will never do it right. We will never do it enough. We will do it very flawed, and that's okay. The important thing is we're continuing to change the status quo and change structures. And when we let ourselves off the hook from these white norms of perfectionism and doing everything just right, that's when it, I think, started to feel really invigorating and positive and exciting for me, instead of like never enough, because it won't be ever enough and we can't do this fast enough. But we need to move forward full steam ahead without any expectations of, you know, pats on the back or whatnot, and just to give ourselves grace, to give myself grace to do this in a flawed manner and with humility and being open to that feedback, and waking up tomorrow better than today has been the biggest gift for me as a leader. And I got that from sort of trying to do my own work and talking to people and reading books like Ijeoma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race that Randy mentioned. I highly recommend it. It's an easy read and really powerful. And that was helpful in my own leadership journey.
I would lead with Radical Imagination. The book I would recommend, in addition to Ijioma's, would be Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, because I think we have to invent new models. The reason I think the cultural sector is well positioned to do anti-racism work is because the work of dismantling racism is similar to the work of creating art, in that you have to imagine something that's never existed and then try to create it in the world in real time. And you're going to try and fail and try again. But I think that can be our work. And I think it's scary and overwhelming, and I get all of those feelings. But I think if you lead with imagination, if you put your creative heart and soul into it, I think that to me is what sets you on that journey and what can be your North Star.
I would just say, I think that hierarchy and positional authority is a hoax, and it's oppressive, and really building your own internal resiliency wherever you stand within an organization, in separating your own personal responsibility and accountability, separating your own accountability from your own, I guess, identity. Like, you are not a bad person if you do something poorly. You just need to move on and repair that harm and then move on. I think being in a position of being in a position of like authority or power is really dehumanizing in a lot of ways. And I think like both humanize the folks that are doing the work that you don't necessarily have access to, and also if you were one of them, just try to be mindful of ways in which you can be in authentic and real relationships. If you need another book recommendation, the work that we've all been talking about in some ways about moving on to self-managed organizations is called Reinventing Organizations. It's by Frederick Laloux, and I think that's what Rainier Valley Corps is using as a model for just eliminating hierarchy and structure from organizations. So that one's a good one to check out too if you're interested in moving your organization to a flatter structure.
I dropped those books. I didn't put So You Want to Talk About Race. I put that in the chat, I think, but both Emergent Strategy, Reinventing Organizations, I put links to those books. And then let me just drop I'm just going to put one more in there because we have the gift of the internet. And I will drop that in the chat as well so that everybody has the links in there. I just want to say thank you to the three of you for being here today during your busy schedules, and just being willing to be vulnerable and courageous in sharing where each of you have been as individuals, as organizations, the work that you've been doing. I'm going to, this was recorded, so I will put it into a file, make it kind of look nice with my limited technical ability, and we'll send it to everybody so that you can share that with organizations. We'll get the captioning going. I promise before the next Lunch and Learn I will have someone else do the captioning or figure that out. But I just wanted to thank each of you. I know like it's a challenging time right now. So I appreciate each of you taking the time and being vulnerable. To our participants as well, like, thank you for being here and choosing to prioritize this work. I encourage you to continue to experience that discomfort, be curious about that. Remember that our comfort is not above other people's safety and their ability to be free and to be liberated and to live. So please continue to be curious about that. And if nobody has anything else, I just want to say thank you. It's always odd signing off of Zoom. And I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. Cool. So I'll see you all soon. Take
Thanks
care.
for having me. It's my pleasure. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Randy.